Hi, welcome to another Potential Power Nutrition training. We are so blessed today to have our guest, Dr. Peter Nickless. So I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction of Dr. Nickless. Dr. Nickless is a chiropractor. He graduated from what was New York Chiropractic College and now Northeast College of Health Sciences. He also has a master's in nutrition from Bridgeport University, has a master's in operations and projects management, has a master's in business administration, and he has a Ph.D. from Rutgers. And so he really is incredibly well educated. Additionally, he is the current dean of all the online programs at Northeast College of Health Sciences, but he was also the dean of the Masters in the Masters of Science in Applied Clinical Nutrition after me, and not immediately after, but many years. He's done a phenomenal job, and the majority of our graduates actually had him as the dean, so that's really exciting. And he also is an elite athlete. And so this is why he is our guest. And so he knows lots and lots and lots about athletes and nutrition. And so, Dr. Nickless.
Hi, how's it going? I'd like to say I was an elite athlete. Now I'm a beat up old man. So I'm bridging the other side of that, where I get to now coach more than I get to compete. So
That's super exciting. Yeah, no. Do you want to say which was your favorite thing? I mean, I think you should tell everybody about your lifting.
Sure. I mean, I competed in sports throughout my entire life, and so I was that perpetual three-sport athlete all through middle school, high school, college. I got recruited for football. Ended up playing club hockey and club lacrosse, which is not part of a formal team. When I quit. When I left college and actually came to chiropractic college, in the interim before I was about to start chiropractic college, I got sick of not having anything to do athletically. So I started training in powerlifting. And since my brother and I were living together and doing this together, some of those who've seen the two of us together call us the bookends. Decided that rather than just doing a little bit, of course it has to be my entire life and world. So I did, while I was in chiropractic school, I competed in powerlifting. I was able to compete on a kind of like more on the national and world level. I won the AAU national championships as a junior, so under 23-year-old lifter twice. I won the world powerlifting championships, the drug-free world powerlifting championships once. And I think it was something about, I don't know the numbers anymore, but it was a decent amount of American records and at least one junior world record in the bench press, actually. Then when I left and I decided I was going to go into practice, I decided to transition over to Olympic weightlifting, which is, for anybody who's ever done it, powerlifting makes you big, it's stiff and slow. And so Olympic weightlifting is meant to be flexible and speedy. And that's really the sport I really particularly liked. So I managed to find a great coach, a gentleman named Arthur Dreschler. He's the person who wrote the weightlifting encyclopedia. And I worked with him for about 10 years. And during that time, I was able to compete at every level from local small competitions to state competitions, the national championships, the American Open, the Arnold Classic, the secondary world team qualifiers, etc. And I got lucky enough to go as an athlete coach to the Olympic trials in 2008 in Atlanta, which was a great experience. I also was able to go to the 2007 World Team Trials to help coach at that event. I've gotten to work in the medical side of these competitions quite a bit. And then now I still lift, not nearly as much weight, but I am actually in about 3 weeks going to do a small bench press competition. I'm hoping to do something in about the mid 550 range. But my target is set on in early September if I go. The United States Powerlifting Association state bench press record is within sights, and I'd like to look at that. I'd like to look further towards what their association world record would be. From a coaching standpoint, I have coached Olympic weightlifting, but I've also I currently spend a significant amount of time, a lot of time, coaching youth hockey. So my daughter plays travel hockey. She's 12 years old. She's going on 13. And so I've been coaching travel hockey for the past, well, I've been coaching hockey for about the past 5 years, but I've been coaching travel hockey the past two. As we're going into the next season, even just last night, we were taking a whole group of 12 and 14-year-old aged group hockey players, female hockey players, through a dry land training. So down in the Skinny Atlas Community Center, I mean, we're doing laps, we're doing strength training, speed work, shooting, stick handling, and things like that. So
Yes, and so this kind of how we're supporting each other. So Dr. Nickless also part of our network and supporting especially the girls. So that's working great. So we're going to do some questions. So this is complex athletes, right? Because there's all these different sports. So since they're so unique in their energy requirements and their nutrient requirements, how do you figure that out? Like, how do you tailor what you're going to do for, say, the youth hockey versus that power lifter, or that power lifter that's shifting from one weight class to another?
see, this is the part where exercise physiology kind of meets nutrition. And that's the one caveat I always have with sports nutrition, is there's a certain degree where you kind of, you don't need to understand exercise physiology in detail. I know I certainly don't, but getting a good idea of the energy systems involved in the individual sports. And to me, that means if I have an athlete that I'm working with, the first thing I want to do is to learn everything I can about their sport, how they train, what they do, etc. The example I could give is I was actually mentoring a nutrition grad who was working with sports nutrition, and she was working with rock climbers out in Yosemite. And so obviously, while I have done some rock climbing, it's more of a recreational thing, and I'm not built for rock climbing, so it's certainly not something I'm going to do on a regular basis. Um, I had to go out and learn everything I could about what was expected, especially big wall climbing when we're out on the ropes for significant periods of time. So with that, I mean, you're looking at something like a hockey, which is going to be an explosive based sport. I mean, if they're spending more than 45 seconds on the ice, your shift is too long. So while there's an overarching aerobic base going on, a significant portion of their athletic activity is anaerobic in nature. Now, we can contrast that through a workout during the course of the week, where they're doing up to an hour, hour and a half of complete aerobic activity with almost no breaks and short bursts. If we compare that in the energies and what we're going to use to fuel that, and then we compare that to your average power lifter, who, I mean, power lifter is different than a functional fitness athlete, or any other kind of an athlete, in the sense that if you're squatting and you're doing a set of five, you're doing cardio. So traditionally, five would be the highest level, mostly triples, sets of five. And then as you get closer to a competition, you're breaking that down to doubles, singles. In Olympic weightlifting, it's even more so. Repetitions at over 85% intensity is very uncommon. So it's not an uncommon thing to see this absolutely sudden burst of energy for a near maximal attempt, having you go sit down for sometimes up to 5 minutes with plenty of time to recover, to regenerate ATP and to get back, and then go back and do it again, which is a very different demand on the energy systems. So when we look at things like carbohydrate load, carbohydrate expectations, the amount of carbohydrate versus fat consumed during a specific time period, or just frankly the amount of just generating or circulating ATP or creatine phosphate that we're using to fuel those activities, the demands are so completely different that what I would do in terms of fueling them is different. And then when we look at recovery and post-recovery needs, protein amounts, things like that, ultimately I always say is always needs to start with what's the sport you're doing, and then how does it work? What does a typical training period look like? What does your season look like? And then take it from there. So
Yeah, I think that that's incredibly well said. I think whether you're working with a patient in a certain group, or you're working with a client, I clearly what I'm getting from what you're saying is how important it is to know how much time they're spending in active whether it's aerobic or anaerobic activity and how much rest time they're going to have between. And you have to really understand at least that level
Yep.
of physiology.
Yes.
Sounds great. So that means then that sometimes people make mistakes. What do you see as the most common nutritional mistakes that athletes make? And
Okay, sorry.
could they avoid them? Could they avoid them?
I mean, the first piece, obviously is patterning their diet based on somebody they've read or something they've read somewhere. And the fact is, no two people need the exact same thing. No two people have the exact same requirements. Now, there's certain generalities that can be crossed over, but if I go online and I see the diet that Thor used to get shredded, for the movies, that doesn't mean I should follow his diet. First off, that was designed for him by a professional. We have no idea what his training really is. We actually have no idea what his diet really is. And we have no idea what else might potentially be going on in that case. So one of the biggest things I see, Thor is obviously the pop culture example, but I often see this when people will look at the diets of an Olympian or of somebody they admire and try to follow that. That would be probably the first thing I would say. I see this really commonly actually when I'm dealing with the parents of the youth athletes I'm working out with, because they don't even know what they're doing. So they're making those mistakes and they're going out there and they're saying, okay, well, so and so is doing this in the NHL, so my son should really be doing this at 12 years old. And the demands, the sizes, all these things are completely different. Um, you know, Avoiding that's a nice and easy one. First, it doesn't mean you have to go and find a nutritionist to do this, but it doesn't hurt. Having somebody sit down and write out a really clearly designed meal plan, or more specifically diet plan for you based on your individual needs, is really the best starting point. And you'll find many athletes who do know an awful lot about nutrition, and many nutritionists even will hire somebody to do this and work with people. Other mistakes I see is people jumping to supplementation before they're really solidifying their diet. And that's the big thing that really kills me when I see that in the gym is, you'll see somebody who, they've got their pre-workout, they've got their jug of water, they're going to leave the gym and have their protein shake. And I have no issues with that at all. Absolutely. In sports nutrition, those are decent. Some issues with the pre-workout. But, um, but it's the fact that when you see them and they do that, and then you see them, a little while later in the grocery store, and they're pushing a cart full of junk. To say I through a good portion of my weightlifting career, it was about calories, protein, and I didn't know what I was doing. And I competed at a body weight probably about, I'd say, close to 150 pounds more than I weigh now. And I didn't have to. I could have been as effective, at least 100 pounds lighter than I competed.
Yeah, I'm going to always sort of summarize this a little bit. I think what I hear you saying that's really powerful for somebody like me, and I think for women to really understand just what you're saying, that body comp is important, and to just look at just calories is not always going to be the best idea. I think you saying I had the lean tissue I needed to get that lift done, and I didn't have to be quite as heavy. That is powerful, I think, for people to hear that.
Yeah.
And I love your whole thing about the hydration, because that's our next question. What actually is this whole thing about optimal hydration? How much should be hydrated ahead, during, after? What are your thoughts on all of this new hydration, all these products?
So, I mean, like, I tend to like, the general protocol they always say is, now we've heard many different things. So you hear some people say half your body weight in ounces. I think that's a great generality, but it really depends. If you're 440-pound Brian Shaw, well, maybe at his biggest, he's 440 pounds. I don't know that I want him going to 220 ounces necessarily. But I do think there's a certain individualized component to it. So the most basic assessment they always say is, On average, it's about 2.7 liters for women, about 3.7 for men. And I think that's a general way to look at it. I think during, before workouts, I would, assuming you're sticking to a general hydration plan all day, I would say about 2 to 4 hours. I would make sure you're getting about 21 ounces of fluid, about 2 to 3 hours, 2 to 4 hours out, about 20 minutes out. I'd stay about 7 to 10 ounces. And again, you're not going to go wrong by going a little higher. And then about every 10, 20 minutes during, you should be, and not wait, it's been 10 minutes, I need to consume 7 ounces, but just keep sipping that. And you should be going at a rate of about 7 to 10 ounces about every 20 minutes throughout. The after exercise, the different schools of thought. One is there's the more accurate way of doing it. One, and the other one is more just like a general kind of general rule, which is you should, after your workout, if you find that your urine is getting darker in color, you should be starting to drink until that starts to get a little bit more pale. Technically, what would be a good idea would be to figure out, ideally the best would be to figure out your sweat rate, which is not super realistic for most people. But on the other hand, one of the things you can do is weigh yourself post workout. And then, for every, pound you lose, you should be looking to replace about 16 to 24 ounces of fluid, ideally, water. As far as like, and this is another thing I see a lot of is, especially with the youths, the jump to Gatorade. And it really depends on what you're doing. I'll be honest, I don't see a lot of my athletes with hockey, and I'm going to include adults in this, that are losing enough electrolytes during the course of an event that during the event they probably need to replenish as much. After the event, probably, absolutely, and especially if we're at a tournament where they're doing 3 or 4 games. But if they're just doing one 60-minute bout, and at best they're pulling about 15 minutes spread out over that hour, water's probably fine.
That's really interesting. I think when you talk about that, especially this kind of idea that you're going to lose a lot of minerals if you're sweating. That's sort of a little off script for you and I, but I think what I'm hearing you say is we're not actually necessarily during the activity in a short burst losing that level of minerals that we would have to replace them. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
I don't think you're losing as much during that event, that the rapid replenishment is so necessary. Your average athlete, your average person goes to the gym for an hour. They're not sweating so much that their performance is declining from an electrolyte imbalance that quickly, and not so much that they couldn't replenish that just from going back and eating normally afterwards. Now, if you're doing an extensively long workout, if you're a runner and you're doing you're doing your long run for the week, and you're out there for well over an hour, yeah, you're probably going to start getting to that point where you can make a huge difference with the need for replenishment. But I don't, I think people tend to overestimate what they're doing. And I think the example I would give is if we look at strength athletes in particular, again, it's a difference between what you're doing. So if you are in a competitive strength training environment where, and I'm not talking about bodybuilding, is kind of a different animal. That can have its whole other series of conversations. But in powerlifting, I will go and I train on Sundays with a group of guys where, somebody during the course of the day is probably going to go up to about an 800-pound bench press. And we have another chiropractor in the group who's in his 50s, and he's a smaller gentleman. He's about 220 pounds, and he just bench pressed 630 pounds at a competition. But like we might spend 5 minutes in between each individual lifter. Like I might take on my heavy lifts, I might take 15, 20 minutes in between them. So I don't really think we're losing electrolytes. I mean, unless it's extremely hot out. And that's always a factor that you need to keep in mind, is what the external temperature and things like that are.
I think that's really great for all of us to think about because, things get to be very trendy.
Yes.
Our next question is, I think, well, you and I, we already know we're on the same page about this. When we're talking to an athlete about supplementation, right?
Yes.
And how is it, I would say we know that they may need some supplements. I always used to say it's food first and supplementation after, because it's not called food substitution, it's called supplementation. And so with that sort of, I know that you and I are on the same page, that you got to look at those macros before you look at the micros. So how do you get that across? Like, how do you talk about the macros and then the micros and the supplements?
All right, well, so again, as you said, we're on the same page as far as that's concerned, and hopefully everybody in this room who's a graduate of our nutrition program is on that same page as well. You know, I always say is I always look at it like a pyramid, right? And the base of that pyramid is a solid food plan. And so for me, that's going to start with I always focus on macronutrients first, get those macronutrient ratios dialed in and solid. Make sure you're getting the micronutrients in. Then you're going to focus on hydration, and then you're going to focus on both nutrient timing, and then supplementation to me is that final piece. So like again, I go macro, micro, hydration. I go meal timing, intra, peri workout nutrition, and then supplementation is just that. It's literally the icing on the cake. Although in most sports, I wouldn't necessarily recommend eating cake. But I think there's a rush to supplementation. I think, and the problem is supplementation sometimes can mask or because it'll promote some growth, but not necessarily what you're looking for. The easiest way I can approach it is I tend to work with athletes who are in sports where they might have an Olympic dream. And the good news is, like when I did my entire athletic career in an Olympic sport and in a drug tested sport, I didn't play around. I did use a protein supplement in the off season. I actually didn't even do a protein supplement during the season, and for reasons that I'll get into in terms of what I consider concerns. But multivitamins mostly because I knew that I just wasn't really getting a solid, I wasn't getting everything I needed. And plus, there's some areas where that fluctuates. And while I might be good collectively, I might have, a couple of days where I just haven't gotten enough of one micronutrient or another. I take more supplements now as a retired old man than I did as an athlete. As a matter of fact, during most of my athletic career, it was a multivitamin, protein, and food. And part of the reason for that, and it's a question we had listed for later, but it is supplement quality is a major issue. And unfortunately, as you're getting drug tested, there have been athletes who have failed drug testing because of just taking supplements, because there are issues. And the Department of Defense actually maintains a website. It used to be nutrition411.org. I don't know if it still is, but they used to maintain a website where they would do random samplings of supplements, and they would actually report when they had failed. And some of the things that they failed were absolutely insane. Pre-workouts are a great example, which is kind of some of my concern about pre-workouts is a lot of the pre-workouts end up having amphetamines in them. And so you're taking something that is going to get you amped up, but you didn't expect it to be something that could potentially be dangerous. And there's there are a couple of ingredients that have been banned by DMAA has been banned from certain sports. I know we had an athlete who was taking Ultimate Orange, and this was the late 90s, early 2000s, and she'd won a national championship. And when they drug tested her, she tested positive because ephedrine was in Ultimate Orange, and she didn't know. It wasn't on the label, and it then got put on the label. But so we always had that hanging over our head, is the fact that we could get drug tested at any competition, that random testing thing. So when I work with athletes, it's that. But the biggest thing I'm seeing right now, which I'm not a big fan of, is that pre-workout supplement. I don't get me wrong. There's a lot of pre-workout stuff that I used to do after I retired. That I actually do like. Some of these, the ones that are, is it the C4, things like that? I'm not a big fan of those. I don't think they're having the effect that they have an effect, but they don't necessarily have the long-term benefit that I think they should.
That was very thorough. And yeah, I think that would be great. So if you had to say, the person is doing a great job. They're having the right amount of protein. They've figured that out with their goal. They know what they're supposed to have by using one of those numbers, like either 1.2, 1.5, 1.8, 2.0 grams per kilogram of ideal body weight. They're doing that. They know their carb loading. They're doing the right timing of their meals. If we have to talk about a supplement, what would you say? Like if they're gonna on the top of the pyramid, since everybody's got all these energy drinks, all these workout drinks, what would you say? And when people are watching this video later, what would you say? Like, what would you love, and what would you be like, oh, I don't think it's worth
Sure.
it?
I don't like the highly synthetic pre-workouts. I just, it's a chemical nightmare sometimes. But I always found a small dose of powdered cocamine was actually my favorite. That absolutely, obviously the old days of just good old fashioned, cup of coffee about half an hour before you work out sometimes works too, right? I liked cocamine powder. The drawback to cocamine powder is if you've ever had it, it smells like chocolate. So you make you think it's pretty good, but it tastes like death. So you really just want to mix it in, hold your nose and drink it. Mix it with some water, hold your nose and drink it. I have heard of people putting it in coffee. I think that's a little overkill. Start small amounts, increase. I don't personally go so far for the branched chain amino acids if they're getting a complete protein. If they are getting enough protein and it's of sufficient quality, they probably don't need it too much. I do favor it if they're cutting, if they're in a phase where they're going to need it, or there's going to be periods of potential, starvation or periods of fasting. Um, I'm a huge fan of creatine, and that was one of those ones where I had to retire just to be able to take. The drawback to creatine, of course, is significant portion of the population just doesn't respond to it, and so you're going to give it to people, and they're going to be, this did nothing for me.
You know,
And yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
well, no, there's a significant portion of the population that does nothing for me, and I'm personally a super responder. So if I start taking creatine, yeah, it's going to put 10 pounds on me, and most of it's water weight, all of it's water weight initially, but my 1 rep max doesn't change, but my 3 and 5 rep max changes. So I'll have that extra endurance, so I can just work out just a little bit harder. And there have been studies with muscle protein synthesis where they go that step further with creatine, where it's not just the energy and things like that, that there actually is some increase in muscle protein synthesis with it. Um, you don't need to go to any of the fancy versions and
Oh,
things like that.
you know me, I love the whole reasoning. I think I actually figured that out from a biochemical point of view. I think that the reason it has the cost benefit ratio for people is that since creatine is made from glycine and arginine, I think some people have really, really healthy creatine synthase enzymes, and they don't need it because they have those two amino acids. But there is a whole group like you and others who just don't do as great a job. And so I think we'll do maybe a little video, since I love my biochem, on what's the percentage of people, I'm writing myself a note, who would really benefit from creatine or carnitine, as a matter of fact. So hit me up on carnitine. What would you say?
Yeah. I love carnitine. I love carnitine, and actually you mentioned arginine. That's one that makes its way, not all the time, but it makes its way in there. And there's been some interesting studies in terms of growth hormone stimulation. I love nitric oxide. I love nitric oxide, and that's a good one. It's going to lower the blood pressure. It's going to, for the gym rats, it's going to increase the pump, but it's actually going to have an impact on stimulating growth hormone production as well. I love beta alanine. Um, I don't take all of these at once, obviously. But I'm also, the stuff that's to me staples are your fish oils. I love any curcumin, any anti-inflammatory stuff, because again, I'm a beat up old man. And I'm a firm believer in just digestive enzymes, which is not one of your typical sports supplements, but honestly, you know, especially if you're consuming a large amount of protein. But I feel better with them. I work better with them. And I guarantee you I'm going to miss about 100 of these. I love fish oil. I know a lot of people are getting big into like CBD and things like that. I have never. I still, I've tried it. I just hasn't had the effect for me that I had hoped. um, but it's not something that I can see the reason to do it.
Yeah, no, I'm really intrigued as you are the dean of the program, and I know you took the food science class, and you're a really great clinician. As I hear you speak, it makes me really understand this idea that you really have to meet with people and have a foundation that we're talking about, where we're saying that macronutrient, have 100% of your vitamins, have your antioxidants, have your good quality fats, all the stuff that I'm a big on the foundation. I'm super into that. But I think when we talk about these other things, I made a note of all of them. And so probably what I'll do, since I love my biochem, I'll put something together and we'll have part two. I'll run it by you, whether you can join us or not, but I'll be like, Mary Bellietta and Peter Nickless discuss the biochemistry of supplementation and who's going to benefit. We'll figure that out. That is fabulous. And I'm always intrigued by this personally. What should I be doing pre-workout, food wise or supplement wise? How far ahead? When should I get that in versus when should I do that post-workout recovery thing? So like, is it the same for everyone? Should we all be doing that
Oh
same
no.
pre? No, of course not.
And
Go.
again, it depends on what you're doing. Depends on, like technically, is it was it technically air rifle is an Olympic sport, right? I don't really think there's a lot of pre-workout nutrition. Now there are supplements that can help air rifle. Anything that's kind of like a beta blocker or anything like that might work. Passion flower would be pretty good for air rifle, but clearly we're not too focused on that right now. It's hard because the one thing I would recommend is, I always recommend making sure that make sure your last meal before you're going to work out or have an event has at least 20 to 30 grams of protein in it. And I would say 1 to 2 grams per kilo for carbohydrates. I prefer lower glycemic carbohydrates. I don't want you getting a huge insulin spike. There are a lot of issues. I just had a triathlete reach out, or the family of a triathlete reach out to me because it's a friend of a friend, and it's somebody who's been getting a lot of basically reactive hypoglycemia. So they're eating a ton of high glycemic carbohydrates before an event. Now, it's one thing if they're doing it just as they're initiating, which they really shouldn't. That's not necessary. But they're doing it and they're getting enough time for their blood pressure to spike because they're not immediately going and running. And so they're just getting that plummet out there. And so they're about 20 minutes into the run and they're having their blood pressure drop. They're getting dizzy and things like that. So I always kind of like to recommend more of a lower glycemic carbohydrate before that time period. A lot of people will struggle digesting if it's less than an hour before. That's where you get a lot of people who resort to those quick bars and shakes and things like that. And again, the shakes are, I think shakes are a different animal than a bar. Okay, because the shakes are usually more pure ingredients, fewer ingredients, things like that. Bar gets a little bit more complex. But I personally, I could not work at my best if I ate within 2 hours of a workout. Now I know people who could eat like literally in the gym while they're lifting. I couldn't do it within 2 hours of a workout because I got agitated. I got agitated and worked up. And I know I also sometimes feel just a little bit just a little logy sometimes. And I know I'll have our goalies, when I talk to our goalies, I'll have our goalies actually make sure they don't eat within an hour just because they get a little bit slow in terms of the reactions. During the workout, again, it's going to depend on what you're doing. Safe to say, archery, although they found out, was it the senior games, archery was the sport that had the second most walking compared to actually speed walking. And that's because they have to go do the target and back and target and back and target and back. But general rule of thumb, if you're going to the gym for a half hour, under 45 minutes, really, you don't need to eat anything during the gym. There's no real major peri-workout nutrition. Keep up your hydration, keep that water. But, you know, honestly, if you can't make it through a 45-minute circuit training session in the gym, something has gone horribly wrong in your life. I'd say 30 to 60 minutes. That's when you start getting into that realm of about 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. That's where, and you really don't need to do too much protein while you're working out. But 30 to 60 grams of carbs per hour, I'd say start that at the 30-minute mark. I would go about every 30 minutes or so and keep it going. I usually I lean towards 30 grams about every half hour, just for that sustained energy. And it really depends because the higher the intensity sport, the more you're going to start, you know, you're going to go through all those energy systems as you go. So you're going to burn through those glycogen stores, and you don't want to get to that point where you're running out of that. So you just want to keep that fire fueled. You know, again, you know, anything beyond 3 hours, that's where we're definitely going to be. Like, that's the point where you have to throw in an electrolyte replacement. You're definitely going to have a problem. I'd say that could even go as low as 2 hours before that becomes a major issue. Doesn't mean I'm not saying you don't need hydration through the entire time period. I just mean, now I will say, when you're doing about intra-workout nutrition, what you're eating makes a difference. You know, now I've seen the studies, and there's some great studies out there. You know, mashed potatoes. You don't need to go out and buy these expensive sport gels, right? Mashed potatoes works just as well. But think about it from the standpoint of, you know, surface area, right? Mashed potatoes have got this extremely high surface area because they've almost been pre-chewed in a sense. And so you can absorb them very quickly. Gels have that benefit as well. Drinks work out really well. But you'll find, especially when you get into long distance runners, they can't tolerate actual food for very long distances. And I know it's weird. Everybody's different. This is where you have to test it for yourself. Some people end up getting huge GI issues if they try eating too much while they're doing events. And meanwhile, I knew, you know, I knew a runner who just packed a fanny pack full of marshmallows. And first off, I'm just gonna say, very processed marshmallows. He wasn't going and getting organic marshmallows. He was just sitting there popping marshmallows as he ran, which just to me sounded hilarious, but also weird, and not what I would consider to be ideal. So you know, now as far as post workout, that's when that protein comes into play. I mean, and personally, I mean, I would say I would look at least 30 grams of protein post workout. And then I would go with about a gram per kilo of carbohydrate afterwards. And that's where you start seeing like the studies that talk about chocolate milk and the ratios associated with chocolate milk. And that's where the higher glycemic carb gets in there as a factor. And they, you know, I liked conceptually the chocolate milk thing. I don't necessarily always like chocolate milk, especially with a lot of the ingredients in chocolate milk. Plus, I do tend to find that the amount of protein in chocolate milk isn't exactly what I would want. And part of that's based on my body weight and what it takes to fuel me. So when I want 30 grams of protein, that's when to me that shake comes in handy, right? That's when it's really important for me. And I would say is that I would recommend, honestly, you know, as you're leaving the gym is probably the best time for that. I think it's the easiest to digest. That's where I usually finish all my workouts. I'll have a shake, and then I would usually within an hour I'll resume kind of my normal eating patterns for the day.
That
And of
sounds
course, all this has to be factored into whatever your bleeding was. So
exactly. That is our pre-organized questions. So I'm going to stop the video and the studio audience can ask questions. So I'm just going to do that now.